Hello, everyone. My name is Russell Shorto. I was invited to talk to you today about one of my favorite subjects, and that is Amsterdam. I was invited by the Spinozafestival to come there, and unfortunately, I couldn't make it. So instead, I'm speaking to you from my home in the mountains of the state of Maryland. So thank you to the Spinozafestival people for inviting me. So this topic is about Amsterdam and liberalism and what it is and is not in my estimation. Um, as you may be able to tell, I'm not Dutch. I'm an American, and my approach to the city, therefore, is as a foreigner. And I think my book about the history of Amsterdam has its roots in the very first day I entered the city, which was many years ago. And I had been to many places around the world, but I distinctly remember this feeling of uniqueness as I was in a taxi going down the Utrechtse and as we passed the Prinsengracht, and I looked to my left and to my right, down the canals and the canal houses, and then to the Keizersgracht, and then the Herengracht, and then ultimately coming to what was then the very chaotic Rembrandtplein. Um, I just remember feeling this is a different place. I've never been to a place like this before, and I was very conscious um, of the physical city having been sculpted by its history, and that fascinated me. That's my dog barking, and that really fascinated me. And ultimately, years later, I wrote a book about the history, and in that, I talked about how I saw the city as shaped above all by one idea, and that is liberalism. So liberalism is a philosophy of individual freedom. Um, within the word is the Latin root liber, meaning free or freedom. Liberalism in Dutch is similar. Vrijzinnigheid is what is in the subtitle of the Dutch version of my book, and the vrij makes it clearer. Liberal is a little bit more hidden, the root of freedom in there. So it's a philosophy of freedom, and there is a funny thing about freedom, which is that everybody in the world, every political party, anyone you can think of, supports freedom. So how is there so much disagreement? And it's because it depends on what kind of freedom you're talking about and freedom for whom. So I'm going to begin. Let me see if I can get a PowerPoint started here. There, I think that is working. Hold on. Let me get rid of that. Okay, so let me just by way of example on this conundrum of freedom and how people interpret it according to their own logic. I think a very good example are the English Puritans of the 17th century. And that little black and white in the corner there represents an English Puritan family of the early 17th century who felt oppressed by, persecuted by the Church of England, from whom they had, which they wanted to purify, hence the name. They became so upset by the situation that eventually they emigrated to the Netherlands because they heard that freedom was a big thing there. They ended up in Leiden, and they lived there for a number of years, and they found the freedom. And they were, by many accounts, appalled by it. And that is because they didn't really want freedom of religion for all. They wanted freedom for themselves to practice their faith. And what happened was over time, as their children began to interact with other children and learn new ideas and be exposed to other religions, other branches of Christianity, this freedom, it turned out, wasn't what they wanted at all. So a group of them then decamped and made their way to America. And these became some of the founders of the New England colonies. And there, then they set up this new society in a quote wilderness. I say quote because, of course, it was intricately populated by the native people. Um, and they set about. So the irony of American history is that Americans tend to look at the Puritans and the settlers of New England as these exponents of religious freedom. In fact, they were only interested in their own religion. And in fact, they persecuted violently often people of other Christian denominations, most famously, as depicted here, the Salem witch trials, which burned people at the stake for seeming to veer from their beliefs. So that to me is an example of how freedom is often misinterpreted. So let me move forward here. Talking about my book, I was asked by the publisher to do a new edition of it for the 750th anniversary of Amsterdam. And it was a very interesting experience for me because I focused on liberalism in the city. And the book came out, the original edition came out 12 years ago. And by the way, the subtitle in English, History of the World's Most Liberal City, and in Dutch, Van de meest vrijzinnige stad ter wereld. I think I meant it as kind of a provocation. You know, I almost wanted people to say, really, or to challenge me and say, no, it's not. And plenty of Dutch people have done that. I think one of the points I wanted the subtitle to make was that at one point in the 17th century, I think there's a very good case to be made for Amsterdam having been the most liberal place in the world. If that is not the case now, then I think it is a testament to the spread of the idea of liberalism, that so many, basically any modern city considers liberal values, openness in a variety of ways, to be part of what it means to be modern. I think when I wrote the book, I assumed that liberal values, in the broad term that I'm talking about it now, was something that everyone agreed in. And I don't mean in what kind of freedom. I just mean the idea of valuing personal freedom. Things have changed remarkably in the past several years, and we've all experienced it. And so for me, this was a case to confront my own ideas about Amsterdam's liberalism and its history. And I have to say that this is a slide I put in there to talk about illiberalism on the rise in Western Europe. Of course, it's on the rise in other places in Russia, in Turkey, needless to say, in my home country. And by the way, there's a few days before the American election. God knows what's going to happen. But when I originally looked at the Amsterdam canals and the canal houses, I saw them as, something is very different here. And I saw them as charming. And I still see them as charming. How can you not? As quaint. But I also see them in many other ways now. Not only as the builders of these houses were people who pioneered tolerance in one form or another, and capitalism in one form or another. I also now, in light of the awareness that many of us have had over the past several years of colonialism and oppression, I see them as manifestations of those things too. That I'm aware now when I look at them that they were built by men who brought untold suffering to people in far-flung corners of the world so that they could build up these houses and build portfolios and raise well-to-do families and funnily enough, build a society based on liberal ideas. And I think that's something for all of us to consider, that I think it's not exclusive to the Netherlands by any means. It has taken a certain amount of comfort, creature comfort, built up in a society for people to have the freedom, the headspace to think about these concepts of a broader social freedom, and so that to the extent that that might be built on illiberalism, I think that's something that's really interesting and worth pondering. So what I'd like to do is to argue that the way I see Amsterdam now, anyway, is that it is still, and certainly once was, an epicenter of liberalism. And at the same time, that its entire history has been, in any era of its history, you see failures to live up to that ideal. So for us, for people who care about and are interested in Amsterdam, what do we do with that conundrum? What do we do with the fact that Amsterdam, in some sense, represents the ideal of liberalism, and time after time after time fails to live up to it? So I'll say a few words about that at the end of my talk. Let me talk about some of the manifestations. First, I'm gonna do a little experiment here. I'm gonna talk about the illiberalism in Dutch history, and then I'm gonna flip it around and talk about the liberal side of things. Over the past several years, we have had so many experiences of Dutch society becoming aware of the role of slavery in its past. We had Femke Halsema in 2021, the mayor formally apologizing for the city's role in the slave trade. Then Premier Mark Rutte doing something similar, King Willem-Alexander doing that. You've had many Dutch institutions, the city of Amsterdam reallocating cultural funds away from the kind of classic mainstream institutions and toward such things like the Concertgebouw, and toward institutions that are in the outskirts of the city. You've got that. There's a slavery museum that's in the works. So in many, many ways, the city is now trying to grapple with this. And it was the slavery, as people are realizing, was not just African slavery, African enslaved people going to the Americas. It also took place among the people of the VOC in Asia. And you see that, and I talked about the city's history being represented in its geography and in its architecture. And when you walk around the city, you see, here Admiral Trump with this enslaved black boy. Jan Pietersen Koen was once a Dutch hero. He was enshrined in here on the right, in the Beurs van Berlage. There was a middelbare school in Amsterdam that until not long ago was named after him. And because he was an exponent, he was one of these people who built the state, and this is part of the irony. He built the state, but at the same time, estimates now are somewhere between 500,000 and 1.1 million people were enslaved under the VOC in Asia, rivaling what the West India Company did in the Atlantic world. This is the West Indies House. And by the way, my office used to be just on the far left there when I was the director of the John Adams Institute. The West India House was the place from which much of the city's corralling of the slave trade took place. And one of the vehicles for that was its colony of New Netherland. This is the Johannes Wingboon's illustration of, I have to check my time here, the Johannes Wingboon's illustration of New Amsterdam in 1664. This was, in fact, this illustration was made when New Amsterdam was at its height. In fact, at the moment the English took over and renamed it New York. Slavery was always a very small thing in terms of numbers in New Netherland. It was never truly a part of the original purpose of the founding of the colony. But the slavery that began under the Dutch was maintained once the English took over. And New York City, in fact, then as an American colony, became a center of the American slave trade. That's Peter Stuyvesant. New Amsterdam, as I wrote about in my book, New Amsterdam, or The Island at the Center of the World, was famous for, I think, what I focused on in that book was its tolerance, its multiplicity of languages, it being an open port. That a quote from one of the inhabitants: "Everyone here is a trader. This is a place of tolerance." At the same time, we have to acknowledge New Netherland as a place of illiberalism, and Stuyvesant as a leader in that regard too. These are documents from the colony. The document on the far left is technically, according to Dutch law, New Netherland was a place, and New Netherland was, I should note, and the city of New Amsterdam in particular, was an outward manifestation of the city of Amsterdam. The city of Amsterdam ran it. And there was this policy of tolerance of religions. However, when it came to the Jews, New Amsterdam tried to make life as difficult as possible for them. And the document on the left, which I apologize is difficult to read, is one in which a Jewish leader, Asser Levy, who appointed himself as a representative of the people, makes a petition to the city council and says, "We deserve a right to be treated as inhabitants." Peter Stuyvesant fought back. He then writes to Amsterdam, and Stuyvesant is overruled. So, in a lot of these issues of liberalism, illiberalism, tolerance, intolerance, you have a policy that's a good idea, and then you have real people who don't want to carry it out, and then you have a struggle. And sometimes the right side wins. In this case, Asser Levy won his case, and he and his fellow Jews were allowed to remain there. The document in the middle is by an enslaved African woman, written. She came probably very early in the life of the colony, and there was slavery in this time was not a formalized institution. So one of the features of it was that enslaved people, after working for a certain number of years, felt that they had a right to petition for their freedom. And many of them did, and they were granted their freedom. In this case, this woman and her husband are then petitioning the council because the laws were unclear. They had an adopted 18-year-old son at this point. They're now older, getting on in years. They're looking ahead to a time when they're not going to be there. And because the laws are unclear, that now grown son might revert into slavery and be enslaved by the West India Company. So this petition is them saying, will you please guarantee his freedom? And in fact, they do guarantee his freedom. So again, you have this kind of back and forth situation. That really striking portrait is of a Lenape or Munsee warrior. There was a vicious war between the Dutch and the Lenape in the 1640s, which is kind of self-defeating because they were there. The Dutch had gone there to do business with the native people the natives trapped furs. They traded with the Dutch for them, and then the Dutch shipped them to Europe. So it was self-defeating to go to war with them. But they did go to war. They massacred whole villages in some cases. This portrait is believed to be of a man who was then captured by the Dutch, and two West India Company soldiers brought him back to Amsterdam and exhibited him for money, this novelty of an American native. And that is, these are three different instances of, shall we say, the limits of liberalism. I wanted to talk about having, I think, given a bit of an overview about of illiberalism. I want to now go back and sketch out the roots or history, the origins of Dutch liberalism. And in one sense, at least, it relates to water. This is the Kromme Rijn, pretty much in the center of the country. And this is where in the year 1160, I believe, the earliest records of a water board forming, a group of people forming an alliance to build dams and dikes to restrain the water. And that is, you might say, the beginnings of Dutch culture in many ways. When I first traveled around the Netherlands, I knew, there were dams and dikes everywhere, and I was looking for them, and I didn't see them. I didn't realize until much later when I went through with some architects and water management people that in many cases, well, in probably most cases, they're hidden. So a road might be running along the top of a dike, and the land slopes down gently toward toward polders, or that, and then houses will be built on the top of the dike, so that the land, in this case to the left, is actually lower than the sea level. In some cases, it's clearer than others. I'm trying to present this as I understood it. I think there's some value in being an outsider. You're never going to understand the history and the tradition and the culture the way a native person would. But being an outsider, you have this curiosity and wonder. And so that's what I hope I bring to my work. So you've got, I was struck when in my first years in the Netherlands by this, the idea that you've got this almost entirely man-made landscape, and that has consequences. The fact that the people built this land themselves created a different kind of dynamic among them, which didn't exist in much of the rest of Europe. You don't see many of these images in the literature. These are people pile driving. They have a haie, I think it's called, the big iron block, and there's a tree trunk, and they are hammering. They're pulling on lines, and there are these songs that they sing, these chants. And on the right corner there, you can see a beer barrel. You needed beer because this was thirsty work. And they would pull in unison and then let it drop, and slowly, bit by bit, this trunk would sink into the shifting soil of the country, in this case, Amsterdam. And dozens of these would be required to support the foundation of a single canal house. So that says something about the water, about the geography, but also about this collective mentality and what was being created by it. Back to the canal houses themselves, all of them, as I said, can be looked at as manifestations of global oppression, but likewise, they can be looked at as places that were built collectively in this way so that individuals could be empowered. And that's, to me, the conundrum of the city of Amsterdam, that it has this collectivist mentality. And at the same time, out of that collectivism come these very strong individuals who then create companies which do all kinds of work around the world, and support this identity, and support ultimately what I'm building to here is this notion, this idea of liberalism. This is I think, to me, a really interesting modern illustration, artist rendering of the situation in about 1200. So we have to channel, we have to control water. So we're going to build a dam down here at the bottom. And then we're going to build up dikes along the side, and the houses are on top of the dike. We're going to dig trenches for the water to run to, and then we can farm the land. And this creates this stable society. And this is that same spot. If you didn't see where I was going here, this is the Dam in about 1200. And about 400 years later, this is Dam Square. And you can see the masts there on the water. And about 400 years later, there it is again. And here we are in Dam Square, looking down that body of water, which is the last stretch of the Amstel River, as it goes to, of course, Central Station is blocking our view of the Eye. And you know, Amsterdam in the 17th century, I always think must have been, if you were walking through it, must have felt like a giant construction site, because there was simply construction going on all over the place. And this is, you can see by the dark red, all this building is going on rapidly and took place in the course of about 80 years. I have my Monty Python and the Holy Grail image there to remind me to contrast this society that was developing in this way around this creation of new land with much of the rest of Europe, which was feudal, where you had a manor and you had a knight lived in a castle and controlled a certain amount of land and controlled the people who lived on that land. And so for hundreds of years, everybody had their fixed role. The knight at the top of the chain, all these other people, functionaries, lawyers and scribes and people who worked for him, and then at the bottom, the peasants. And your children and your children's children would all more or less be in that same, they would all occupy the same rung. In the Netherlands, that didn't hold true so much. And that has to do, I think, in large part with water and land and these decisions. And out of that decision-making, out of that process, comes a different sensibility about individuals. Because if you are empowered in this way as an individual, if there is land now where there was none before, I am given a chunk of it. What do I do with it? I begin to farm my land. Maybe I graze cattle there and I sell the milk, or I create cheese and sell the cheese. So it becomes a nation of entrepreneurs. They see then the value of individualism, and they see that as an inherent and innate value. And so out of that, I think, comes Dutch liberalism. The big manifestation of that is of course the VOC, and you see that all over manifested in all around Amsterdam. This is the world's oldest extant stock certificate. Out of this Dutch sensibility, out of the collectivism around water and individualism that comes out of that, and this sense of individual value, comes all kinds of things. The building blocks of capitalism, shares of stock, the development of the world's first stock exchange, and it was right there pretty much where the Beurs van Berlage is now. The VOC with its vast trade network, the University of Amsterdam building was originally the Amsterdam headquarters of the VOC, and the physical city of Amsterdam all around all of these are, I think, manifestations of that, as are many other things. This is Leiden, the library, but it's the slide is meant to represent a remarkable statistic that I learned many years ago. This estimate that about half of all books that were published in the 17th century were published in the Dutch Republic, and about a half of them were published in the city of Amsterdam. So the city accounts for an enormous amount of publishing. And when you are publishing books, if you've cornered the market on books, books are an industry, but they're more than that, because if you're bringing everybody's ideas to you, then you can benefit from those ideas. So it has this multiplying effect. This Rembrandt, very famous painting of Dr. Tulp, the anatomy lesson, is an indication of several of these multipliers. the rise of science and experimentation and interest in this, the rise of portraiture and the Dutch so-called Golden Age artists were all Rembrandt got his made his name as a portraitist because the people in this era were newly interested in and concerned with themselves and their values as individuals in a way that people in the past were not. The writer Witold Rybczynski wrote a wonderful little book called Home, A Short History of an Idea. And he relates our modern sense of home as an intimate domestic space to gezelligheid, to the Dutch Amsterdam canal houses of the 17th century, that other parts of Europe did not have that same sense of home consisting of a husband and wife and their children and being that kind of intimate setting. All of this comes together in the figure of Spinoza, who is an Amsterdam Jew, who I often liken to Shakespeare, in that Shakespeare could only have happened when he did, at a point when in English history, the English language had taken in Latin, medieval Latin, its underlying layer of Germanic layer, and then French from the Norman conquest. So it was this very rich toolkit from which to work. So similarly, Spinoza, growing up in a family, as a Jew, and in a mercantile family, he was a businessman. His family were business people, soaking up all of these ideas, all of this input, and then distilling it, and distilling it in a political sense. He's the one who, more than anyone else, distills that 17th century notion of liberalism and puts it into his philosophy. So he then, to me, is the ultimate expression of this, because he distills it, and then it's through him that, as a foundational philosophical theory, it gets spread. Let me see whether, yeah, I think that was my last slide. So I just wanted to come back here to the notion of this architecture, this place, and what I think what it means to me, and how where we are today at a time when intolerance, racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, religious bigotry, these things are no longer in the closet. They're now out there for all of us to see. They're all manifestations of illiberalism. It's on the rise in the Netherlands, throughout Europe, certainly in the US. Again, we'll see what happens on November 5th. This is the battle of our time. And we have to fight it. And in fighting it, we can't let Amsterdam's many flaws stand in the way of our recognition that it was a place where these very values and ideals came into being. We have to somehow we have to somehow look at both the history. We have to use history as a shield. Because if we don't have that history, we're standing on nothing. We don't have the foundation. So my closing plea here is to fully examine Amsterdam's illiberal history, and at the same time not lose sight of what it gave us. Thank you all very much for listening to me. I am, again, sorry that I'm not there in person, but I hope to be in Amsterdam again sometime soon, and I hope to see you.